So it's Osmocote 5, the latest Osmocote from ICL. It's our 5th generation product. We don't make a product very often. We update it when there's a genuine technological advance, and it's been 10 years since the 4th generation of Osmocote. So we're now introducing Osmocote 5. We've been working on it for a long time, and I'll tell you a bit more about the trials and how the product works. But it's basically a 5th generation product, and it's going to be replacing our 4th generation Osmocote Exact high end. This was a very successful product, and it gave us some of the highest quality plants that you can produce. But we used a 2-stage process where we had some double coated granules that had a wax coating on as well. And this delayed the release. So we got like a low starting product that released more later when the crop demand was higher. With Osmocote 5, we've taken it to another level. We've managed to produce it in one granule, giving us an S-shaped release curve. And that's really powerful moving forwards. But on the basis of the move to sustainable growing medias and peat reduction, we tweaked the product and increased the elements of it to improve the growth in those conditions. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But from next year we'll be replacing the high-end products with Osmocote 5. But I think when you've seen the presentation you'll understand why we're doing it and what a step forward it is. So as I say, Osmocote 5 has this S-shaped release curve, and it builds on the success of the Osmocote Exact high end. But it's a more subtle curve. Because we're using one product, we get a nice gradual release from low to high, matching the plant demand. It's a 5th generation product, focuses on peat reduction, with the sustainable growing medias. And these are quite a challenge in terms of the higher pHs you experience with them, but also the lower nutrient buffering of those sort of products. And we'll address those with Osmocote 5. So we've got a slightly higher nitrogen percentage and a slightly higher magnesium percentage. And those are key factors that, in peat-free reduction. The performance has had to be proved. We've been doing trials for 7 years on this product globally, and in the last 3 years in the UK at independent research stations like NIAB and lots of nurseries as well, typically Bransford. We've done some big trials over the last 2 years, and on the basis of that we'll be phasing it in next year. A big part of the trials that we do is plant safety, and we try it in lots of regions of the world as well as the UK and Ireland. So we've had trials throughout the islands, showing good results. A big part of this is the new trace element delivery system, which is called OTIA, which is optimized trace element availability, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. And to me that's the real standout thing about the Osmocote 5 is the improved trace element availability and the quality it gives you with the new growing medias. So you're getting a nice S-shaped release curve and a good trace element package within this fifth generation product. The S-shaped release curve, it's not just about the NPK. So in the past, the release pattern, we were looking at the major elements, but in this product, we've managed to match the trace element release with the NPK release. Trace elements are just as important to a plant as the major elements, and it was important to us, to get those releasing at the same sort of speed as the major elements. And if you look at this curve, you probably can't see in much detail, but there's blue and orange lines, and they correspond with the NPK release and the trace element release from the granule over an 8 to 9 month release pattern. And you can see they're completely in harmony there. And this is a real step forward from our 3rd and 4th generation products, where typically towards the end, about 66% of the trace elements would have released, and it would have carried on releasing over time. But it's what we've done, we've managed to push that back into the longevity, get a much better trace element release. The iron release is three times better than with previous products. And it's something we really see within our trials, the better availability of trace elements. So that's the package we're using. It's a combination of, better release from the granule. We're getting less trace elements reacting within the granule because they're very reactive, these things such as iron and copper. So we're able to keep them available, released through the granule, constantly available to the plant and taken up. And the way we do that is obviously utilising chelates. Now, chelates are like organic molecules that exist in nature in terms of things like citric acid and humic acids and things like that. But we use a more powerful version called EDTA, and this has a 4-claw grip. So the organic molecule encloses the metallic iron and keeps it available to the plant. So if you look closely at the top, you can see the cation enclosed by the 4 claws of the cation. And this ensures with these new medias where the pHs are typically 6 and above, that we're still getting good release of trace elements. They're remaining available to the plant within the growing media, and they can be taken up. And when you drill down to the root system, we're really relying on those root hairs to take up those trace elements. So we don't want them reacting as sulfates and being locked up. They're available to the plant. So we've got a very mobile chelate within the substrate. It's available for the plant to take up easily. It's constantly releasing, but it's not being reduced within the growing media and becoming unavailable to the plant. Now, we've done lots of trials, and from an early stage, it was very apparent that the plants were much darker in colour and had a great vitality and glossiness to the leaves. So we did a lot of measurements with a SPAD meter, looking at the chlorophyll index within the leaves, and we saw a significant difference with the Osmocote 5 compared to our best products at the time, which is the high-end products. It was significant across the trials. And in some of the early trials we did across Europe, whether it was in France, looking at Photinias, we got a really good leaf colour, not only dark green, but really bright reds, but also this glossiness and vitality to the plants. And that's really come through in all of our trials. We saw the same thing in our German trials. This really vibrant plants, not soft growth, but just a healthy plant and very sellable. With the vitality there. It's quite a striking feature. We've continued those trials over the last 3 years in the UK. We've done a lot of trials at NIAB. I've done a lot of trials myself, looking at different rates and everything. And at all times, we've been looking at peat reduced, say 40% peat reduced with wood fibre, or completely 100% peat free. And we've been looking at the challenges and how we can give you the best advice moving forward with these products, because we need to stay ahead of the game. So, we've looked closely at all the plants, and this is a peat reduced mix, 40% wood fibre. And generally we were looking at full rates of Osmocote, so there was no other inputs in these trials. But at sort of 4.5, 5 and 6 kilos of Osmocote, 8 to 9, we were looking at the best rates. And with the peat reduced at 4.5 kilos, we got a really good rate, a really bushy plant, dark colour, and the colour continued into the end of the season. So we were evaluating them into October, when the release is lower, and we were still getting really good quality plants. And I think that the advantage is that we've got a fixed longevity with the product. We're making sure that it releases over 90% of the NPK and the traces within the longevity. So you get a real punch, when it starts to come in. You get really good growth, but it's balanced growth. It's not excessively soft growth or anything. When we look at the peat-free, at the same rate of fertiliser, we're getting nice green, dark green plants, which is really good for a peat-free. They're slightly smaller and more compact. And if we increase the rate to 5 or 5.5 kilos, we can get a bigger plant, and we can match the peat-free. I think some of this can be improved over time. So I think these medias hold on less to nutrients. They have a lower buffering of nutrients. And when you water them, you can leach out the nutrients more easily. So I think if they're watered in a sustainable way, and we look at the peat-free on its own, we can reduce the watering and become more efficient with the nutrition as well. So that's moving forwards. We're learning all the time. But as I say, if you're looking at a new growing media, you need to be looking at changing the way you do things, really. It's important to be crop walking and looking at these crops closely and adjusting your water and everything to take into account these things. And it becomes more important, the nutrition package that you have. And if you have quite a low amount of particularly Osmocote going in or fertilisers going in, you might need to review that and put slightly more in. In the trials, we're looking at maybe 20-25% more nutrition required for these sort of crops. This can be done from the Osmocote. It can also be topped up with water solubles. But just bear in mind the way prices have gone with water solubles. It can be quite an inefficient way of applying fertilisers overhead. You can lose a lot of the fertiliser. So a lot of people are increasing the rates of their Osmocote because it's a more efficient, sustainable way, and you get a lot less leaching, and it can actually save money. So we're reviewing a lot of mixes with growers, over the autumn and talking about these things. But when we talk about peat-free, it's not all bad news. There's lots of benefits from it. It's a very light media. It's cheap to transport. You can get quite a lot on a lorry. It does bring the cost down. In terms of growing, it's got quite a high AFP, air-filled porosity, so you get quite quick rooting. It's quite good for overwintering. There's less chance of root rots and that getting in from standing water and things like that. So there are lots of positives. We just need to get on top of the watering. You've probably already seen the H2 Grow presentation, so you understand the tools that we have to make that side of it easier. Compaction, I think in the early days with wood fibre and things like that, they were mainly made for the retail market, and they were quite fluffy and more about increasing the volume rather than having something that was more stable. And the new wood fibres like Fibergo Advance have much more structure to them, and they're much more stable over long term. Irrigation is key, and I will come back to that in more detail. The big issue for me is the nitrogen availability. and so we focus on that a little bit. These peat-free alternatives, whether they're coir, bark or wood fibre, will have a lower buffering of nutrients. So the physical surface of the peat, there's quite a lot of surface area for cations to bond onto. When you come to using a peat-free material, there's less area for those sort of things, and they don't hold as much of the nutrients. So if you take a growing media and you add some base fertiliser like a PG mix in a peat-based mix, if you do the same in a peat-free, you'll find you get a higher conductivity within it. And what that is telling you is that the media can hold less of those cations on the media, and more of it goes into solution. And obviously when you first water that in, you're going to get more leaching. So it's not really about building up lots of nutrients at the start, because they can easily be lost. So you can put things like calcium nitrate in, it gives you a bit of an instant effect, but it's soon gone. So we need to be looking at other alternatives to replace that nitrogen. And it's mainly nitrogen that will be leached. Some of it's from the watering, but it's mainly to do with holding on to less nutrients within the media. So we've developed 3 products that work in tandem with this to give you the best results. So we have the Osmoform slow release nitrogen, the slightly longer term Osmocote N 5 to 6 month controlled release nitrogen, and then we have the combination Osmocote Calmag, which has nitrogen, calcium and magnesium. And that can be really useful for peat-free where you've got soft water, because it can supplement the calcium and the magnesium to give you healthy growth. But obviously, the wetting agent is key to it, and I won't go into that in too much detail, but it's important that when you first water up, you're getting water into all the corners of the pot and the pot fully wets up. It's very easy for these peat-free materials for the water to find the easiest way through. And if you don't establish that in the first couple of waterings, you're really going to struggle with these sort of products. I did a lot of trials on it, and when I first potted them up and we watered them in, we knocking the pots out and weighing them, and we could see there was areas that were still dry. So it's important to have a couple of really good waterings to start off with to get them activated and activate the wetting agents. But it's something we're working on quite closely, and you can see the work that's being done at Amiga there. So what I would say, that the media, when you first get it, it is quite dry and can be a little bit dusty. That's something we're working on with different wetting agents to see if we can reduce that. But after potting, particularly if you're potting plugs into hot greenhouses or whatever, it's really important to water those plugs in as soon as you can, because the moisture content is much lower than a traditional peat-based growing media. So they can dry out in the plot, and you can take some losses quite early on. Subsequent waterings will need less water once you've fully wetted it up. But I think irrigation length will be key, and it's important to monitor them and water when the crop requires it. I think if your irrigation cycle is too long, you're going to get leaching through. So I think it's important to look at the crop and decide on the moment when you've got field capacity, most of the pots are wetted up fully, and stop the irrigation, but maybe go for shorter cycles but slightly more frequently, and that can work quite well. But it's a case of picking up the pots and assessing them and getting used to it, really. Even more key with peat-free reduction now is the water quality. A lot of people have been able to use quite hard water with a peat-based growing media, but as well as these peat-free products not buffering the nutrients quite as well, they also don't buffer the pH quite as well. So is what you're going to find if you have very hard water with lots of bicarbonate, over time you're going to drive the pH of the water up, and then there's going to be less nutrients available. So these are the things to address. It's important to look at your water and decide whether you need to blend it with a softer water source, maybe acidify it, or use a hard water feed to try and improve these situations. But if you look at the graph there on the right hand side, you can see the thinner lines indicating when the nutrients are less available. And as you get to the higher pH, particularly things like iron and manganese are much less available to the plant. And if you can stop the pH rising there, you're going to get much more optimum nutrition. And there we can see with high pH, getting above 6.5 towards 7, you quite easily get iron deficiency there within the roses. So I think we need to look at the crop quite closely, and we can diagnose lots of potential problems early on. And I think if you can do that, you're going to save a lot of losses. Because if you leave a potential nutrition problem too long, they're quite difficult to recover from. You lost quality, and your crop isn't as saleable. By looking at the crop, looking at the new leaves at the top, if you see deficiencies in the tips, it's really indicating that you've got an element that isn't mobile within the plant. So it can't be taken from the old leaves and taken up to the tips. The plant needs it constantly. Things like iron and calcium, and you clearly see it in the tips, and I'll go into more detail on that. If it's down in the base of the plant and it's the older leaves, it's typically going to be magnesium or nitrogen, but there is others. Just looking at it graphically, really, if we look at immobile elements within the plant, you're going to see these symptoms up in the top of the plant. So you're going to have green older leaves and pale leaves at the start. And commonly it's going to be things like iron and calcium. It can also be manganese and copper and other things, but they're less common. But if you look at the plants, and we've got a hydrangea there on the left, you can see up in the tips there, you've got yellow tips with dark veins, and this is characteristic of iron deficiency, and it's quite common, and it can be induced by high pH. So if I take a plant and grow it at a high pH, I can quite easily, induce an iron deficiency, whereas a plant at the same pH can be dark green. So a little element that's required in small amounts can have a big effect on the plant. And anybody that's grown a vinca minor will know that you commonly see the iron deficiency in the tips there. The older leaves are still lovely and dark green, but it's affecting the new growth. And these are things that can be taken account of, but it's important to try and understand where it's coming from. And it may be that the plant's got plenty of iron, but it's just not available to the plant. It could be the pH has risen because you've got hard water. It could be that it's early spring, the plant's got a little bit wet and they haven't really dried out. The plants have lost a few root hairs and then it's not able to take up the iron efficiently and is exhibiting those symptoms. It could be that there's been a root infection from Phytophthora or Pythium or something, and that's affected the root tips as well. So always look at the whole plant, look at the roots, and it'll give you a good idea what's going on. So a lot of these things, it is about iron, but we need to get to the cause of what it is. So we can treat it with a foliar iron, but it's only going to help for a little period. We need to understand why it's happening. So the other thing you commonly see in the tips of the plants is calcium deficiency. This is an example in poinsettias, and it often happens in periods of high humidity when the plant's actively growing. Maybe you've got the vents closed, the humidity builds up. The plant needs to be pulling calcium through all the time. So if there's not much water going through the leaves and evaporating, you won't get the pull through of calcium. And you quickly see it at the furthest points of the leaves. You start getting a browning and a curling of the leaf. You commonly see this in primroses and polyanthus as well in the autumn. When you're growing a crop, you can get some quite high temperatures, but high humidity. And if you're not venting the polytunnel of the greenhouse properly, the humidity can build up and there's no water flowing through the plant. And then quite quickly on the edges of the leaves, you're going to get browning. So these things that could be exacerbated by peat-free growing because there's less calcium and magnesium in the mix because of the lower lime amounts. But just going on to mobile elements, lots of the major elements are mobile within the plant. The plant's really clever. It can break down these elements and move them around the plant. Obviously the young tips are the key to the plant's survival, so it can move things from the older leaves up into the top. So you're going to see yellow leaves at the bottom and greener leaves at the top. And this affects some of the major nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, as well as magnesium, which is very common. And if we look at the plants affected, you can see the poinsettia there. You can see on the left the healthy plant with the dark green leaves. On the right there's a much smaller plant with smaller leaves, and the older leaves are going yellow first. Now we should have stepped in much earlier in this situation, but you can see how much growth you've lost. So it's not just the fact that the old leaves are looking terrible, you've lost a lot of growth in development in the plant. And if you're not careful with peat-free and you don't look at the nitrogen side of it, you can end up with plugs that just sit there and go very pale. And that's a key sign of a nitrogen problem. So I think it's going to be increasingly important to be monitoring our crops and looking at the the conductivity there within the pot. And there's obviously various ways. You can use conductivity meters with probes, or you can sample a pour through solution of the pot. But I think going forwards, we're going to need to be looking at some of these crops and following them through. You can obviously send a sample off to NRM, but I think if you can develop a feeling for the nutrition on your crops, follow a good crop through, it's going to make it easier to anticipate some of these potential problems. But we've got quite a big package of things that we can do to avoid this happening. So the types of symptoms that you can get, whether it's on the top or the bottom of the plant, one of the commonest is what we call interveinal chlorosis, and it's where it goes yellow between the veins. Now if this happens in the older leaves, it's something like magnesium deficiency. If it happens in the top of the plant, it's going to be iron deficiency possibly, or something else. And it happens with magnesium, copper, iron, manganese. These are the common ones. You look at the plants on the ground, and obviously the iron there again, it's an interveinal chlorosis, but we're seeing it in the tips. Magnesium on the right, this is the poinsettia. We're getting interveinal chlorosis on the older leaves, and it's just starting to yellow there between the veins. We need to look at the causes of some of these things, and if we plan our production and make sure we've got the optimum water, we've got a nutrition plan, we're going to avoid a lot of these problems. But just because you see iron deficiency, don't jump to conclusions. It's important to understand why it's happening. And you can see that visual identification is quite a quick way of diagnosing problems. It's always good to follow up with an analysis that you can send off to a lab like NRM. But increasingly, these things can take a couple of weeks to come back. And sometimes you've got to make a decision about, do I give some extra supplementary feeding? And if you can make a quick look at it and decide whether it's high or low, it's going to give you a good basis to move on, really. So we've got some posters, and there's quite a few incidences of the deficiencies that you can look at. So as I say, we're all set to launch this product in the spring. We'll have good availability, and we'll gradually phase out the high-end product.